Hello, I have invited to the studio a scientist who has an amazing story to share. Vladimir Grigorievich Efremov, the lead designer at a research institute where one of the space programs was developed. Professionally, he is a developer of information systems and space navigation systems. He participated in the team responsible for ensuring Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin's flight into space. We will find out how, under incredible circumstances, the scientist's mind continued to pursue the research. Please, Vladimir Grigorievich.
Hello. Everything that happened to me was a complete surprise. I started coughing and couldn't take another breath. I literally just had to exhale the remaining air, and I realized what would happen next, some kind of abyss, oblivion. I would lose consciousness, and that would be the end of my life. And so for the last time, I exhaled one final breath. And instead of losing consciousness, slipping into oblivion, and ceasing to exist altogether, I suddenly feel that I'm flying through a tunnel. This was a completely unexpected turn for me. I never expected that anything could exist after what had happened to me. My consciousness never faded for even a second, so this new awareness in a new situation felt incredibly fresh, vivid, and fascinating to me. In any case, I found myself already flying through this very tunnel. For me, this was a staggering revelation because I had never even suspected that something like this was possible. Once I found myself in a state of flight, I took control of the flight itself. Let me explain what I mean. The thing is, even as a child, I used to fly in my dreams quite often. Well, that's a common experience, typical for young people and women. And for some people, this phenomenon is observed throughout their entire lives, including mine. When I was already an adult, I used to work on modeling the movement of flying vehicles, technical maintenance, and so on. I was interested in flying in dreams from the perspective of how controllable these flights were. And in order to achieve perfection in controlling these flights, I decided to develop a sort of conditional program for myself, which I practiced during these flights. So, in accordance with the piloting technique I had already developed, if I can put it that way, I paused my flight and started to figure out what I should do next. Well, the first thing I noticed was that so to speak, my consciousness was working, and this made a very strong impression on me, because I never expected that after I stopped breathing, after my heart stopped beating, any kind of thought would still be possible. But there it was exactly the opposite. Moreover, my consciousness turned out to be working so powerfully, so distinctly. The distinctiveness of it was in itself astonishing. What was astonishing was the following circumstance. Consciousness was not working in a conceptual way, as it usually does in our real life, as a kind of linear process. Instead, there was a strange blending of conceptual and figurative thinking, in which the breadth of figurative thinking was preserved, along with the qualitative, logical elaboration of individual elements of conceptual thinking.
That is, there was parallel thinking along several branches of cause and effect relationships.
Yes, and the number of these parallel directions along which conceptual thinking was taking place amounted to many hundreds, or perhaps even thousands. In other words, it was an extremely broad scope of such a parallel thought process. And moreover, individual results obtained in one channel could be transferred to another, to a third, and used in the overall thought process, which it amazed me by its very nature. That is,
essentially, the concept of space and time, as we use it, disappeared for you. Not a local chain of thought, but immediately a parallel, polyphonic kind of thinking.
Yes, if there was such a need. And
so how did you solve the problem of navigation in that world?
I solved the navigation problem, as it seemed to me, very simply. I used the well-known principle of how a flying vehicle moves by orienting myself, by comparing the known landscape of the area with the actual terrain that stretched out beneath the flying vehicle. And
what form was the space? There was some kind of heterogeneity to it, right?
yes, there was a certain heterogeneity there, and you could say it was a kind of landscape, but a landscape rolled into a tube. Still, one section was noticeably different from another, and you could in some way remember it. So to speak, the landscape I was flying over. And I decided to check whether this would work or not. So this is the kind of
system
of navigation. It turned out it works. I really do possess this kind of expanded consciousness. I am able, while flying over a certain area, to remember everything down to the smallest details, the entire actual landscape, the terrain that was there. When I reached some distant point, I would turn around and start flying back to the starting point in order to make sure that this navigation system actually works. But when I turned around and started flying back toward the starting point, I was surprised to find that as I got closer to the starting point, the landscape became less and less familiar. It was there. As I moved back and forth, it turned out that the landscape did not remain constant, but instead underwent some specific changes.
Independently of you?
Independently of me. And when I approached the starting point, it turned out that nothing was left of that starting point at all. There, instead of the original starting point, there was something
else, and
unconnected to anything. But somehow the problem still needs to be solved. And here a very interesting thought came to me. If I am controlling the flight, in other words, it turns out that I am controlling the flight through a certain mental apparatus. To put it more clearly, in this specific case, my internal thought process possesses a distinct form of causality and is the primary cause that directly results in the change in my position relative to the surrounding external environment.
Landscape.
And the persistent thought was, couldn't I use something very similar, some kind of dedicated and sustained effort to try to fully restore that beautiful natural landscape and
return to the point from which you started moving?
Return to that point. That is, in principle, is it possible or not at all possible to somehow act upon the surrounding world in order to cause a modification and forcibly return it to its original state? But that initial attempt was actually successful primarily because it finally made it possible to carry out such a significant change. However, it was incredibly challenging, truly and exceptionally hard for everyone involved, and it became clear to me that some additional work would be required here. Techniques working on the effectiveness of methods in order to strengthen such an influence on the surrounding world. And after some time, after a certain amount of training, it turned out that
you returned to where you wanted to go.
Yes, I successfully made my way back to where I originally intended to be, and I found that I was able to reconstruct and follow any specific flight path along the image that I had already flown over during my journey. And then I even had the thought, well, why restore the entire path when you could actually just try to restore the exact point you want to reach right away?
And you end up exactly where you want to be.
That's absolutely right. You see, I knew nothing about teleportation, not even the term itself. At that time, it was completely unknown to me. But nevertheless, I practically managed to do it. To trigger the phenomenon of teleportation and move to the exact point you want, if you know where you want to go and how. Thus, in general, you could say the problem was solved, the navigation issue, but other problems arose for me. So if my consciousness can actively intervene and somehow influence the surrounding world, then the question arose, to what extent is such influence possible? How does it work? What are the conditions and what other features are there? Because the very fact that you can mentally influence the surrounding world and the scope of this influence is undefined. It still needed to be determined, and there are its own peculiarities and laws there. A vast, bottomless field of problems opened up before me, with each one being even more fascinating and interesting than the last.
Then did you try to solve the problem that you needed to solve? In the real world, I mean?
Yes, that's how it turned out, but it didn't happen right away. The thing is, when I started thinking about the surrounding world and my influence on it, I didn't immediately notice one circumstance. Suddenly, time and space ceased to exist. It was unexpected for me. Suddenly, it was just gone, and I was a bit confused by it. Where did it disappear to? From what moment exactly? I mentally returned to the starting point of my reflections, found myself in that same tunnel, and I realized that the thing is, with the kind of expanded consciousness that exists there, there is a fundamental possibility to see all events not in some three-dimensional way, but in a multi-dimensional one. From a multi-layered perspective, and when considering it this way, when you look at phenomena from this perspective, it turns out that with the introduction of multidimensionality, both space and time are lost because time exists simultaneously in the past, present, and future. And it is, so to speak, all present at once, and you can't say that we are in this particular point. That is,
it didn't coincide with some specific fact? No.
It didn't coincide with any specific fact. And then the following thought occurred to me. What I was doing there was connected to the space that existed there. But is it possible to introduce something else into the scope of consideration, some element from my past life? Well, for example, is it possible to see my broken TV, the one that broke just the day before, literally? Well, no sooner said than done. It turned out that yes, it was possible my TV appeared there. And
how did you see it?
First I saw the TV exactly as I usually saw it. But that was literally just the first instant, because immediately, besides this visible, along with the image of this TV, information appeared. Global information connected to this TV. How it was conceived, how it was constructed, how it was developed, what equipment it was manufactured on, and what its specifications were. That is,
so once again, a polyphonic consciousness emerged.
A polyphonic consciousness where, again, time as such was absent, because in the process of creating this TV that I summoned, the entire spatial temporal depth related to this TV was present. And the TV itself, as we usually
imagine it
and see it, actually occupied a rather modest place. Whether I wanted to look at it or not, I simply didn't pay attention to it. But I just want to say that this way of seeing problems, in all its vastness, when you can see all the causes and effects which are usually untraceable everywhere here in this world, they suddenly become apparent. And this gives an amazing awareness of what is happening and of all the phenomena related to the issues under consideration.
So, since you are dealing with the analysis of real processes, does your consciousness possess this quality? By analyzing reality, essentially?
But where do I receive information from?
And
that's another question. But the fact is that, in principle, such information exists. It can be presented, it can be comprehended, and those things that seem random under certain circumstances, there they appear not random at all.
Do you understand? And what caused it to break?
Yes, the T315 transistor from the sweep unit failed, and when I returned a bit later to check the progress...
So that's what happened?
Exactly, and my TV started working.
So in fact, you brought back into reality what...
Yes, absolutely right. That's exactly how it all happened. So another feature that was present there was the following. It was the very informational interaction between myself and, so to speak, the surrounding world. At first it seemed to me that it was just my own thinking, that I was mentally asking myself a question, finding some answer, and it felt like this was simply the result of my well-functioning consciousness. And but over time I begin to realize that I am receiving information that goes beyond any previously known or consciously perceived phenomena. In other words, essentially, The world that surrounded me there was providing me with information on a given topic in the form that interested me.
Tell me, please, did you, apart from the television test, did you try to solve any other technical problem, one that you actually worked on?
Yes, I did solve such a problem, specifically at my workplace. Our team and I, including myself, struggled with it for about 2 years. We were working on solving a scientific and technical problem that was exceptionally difficult due to its multi-component nature and complexity, just structurally very complex. We simply couldn't find a solution that would be satisfactory for this specific problem. And just out of curiosity, although I didn't expect to come back to it, I set myself this challenge. Is it even possible to consider such a problem at all? Go ahead. The whole problem appeared before my eyes, completely and entirely.
Again, in such a polyphony.
All the interconnections were immediately visible and clear, every single one, along with all the specific features. And the very result was obtained, the one that...
Kennedy's brush solution algorithm.
Yes, the solution algorithm. And so the result itself is actually quite simple, but obtaining it is not so easy. Well, in any case, after getting this result, the next day at work, I calmly wrote everything down in my notebook.
Was management surprised?
Well, so to speak, maybe they weren't all that surprised because they thought it was just business as usual, but I was surprised because the nature obtaining such information was very specific.
So essentially, you were really conducting scientific research because on the one hand, you were working with real objects, a television, your task, and on the other hand, you were testing the system that you once used during actual flights, so to speak, in real life. Yes?
And moreover, I only mentioned it in passing, but the thing is, there emerged a kind of intellectual system there where there wasn't just one subject providing
me,
but two. The second subject was me, but I had limited capabilities. A subject. And the whole system as a whole represented a subject with unlimited capabilities. So it turned out that in this intellectual system there was a leading subject and a subordinate one, that is me.
Vladimir Golovich, you just described how you studied this. And now I would like to know how you came back, how long you were in that state, because you accomplished so much, and how much time did this journey beyond the edge of life take?
According to what I've been told, the duration of my clinical death was estimated to have lasted for approximately 5 to 7 minutes.
Only that?
Only that. But to me it seemed like... For some reason it felt to me like it was 55 minutes. Not 56, not 58, but 55. And then suddenly I felt that someone was starting to... I had the impression as if I was in a very deep sleep and someone was persistently trying to wake me up. And then some kind of external influence started to reach my consciousness, which began to disturb me. The essence of this research, I was so captivated that I tried to delay my return for as long as possible.
In other words, it was a good research environment where you could observe life.
Exactly right. And when my sister, who at the time worked as a surgical nurse during heart operations, she understood perfectly what was happening. She brought me back from there professionally and successfully. And then the question arises, what exactly are you so happy about? My whole face was literally glowing with excitement. I said, well, how could I not be? I finally solved a colossal problem that I hadn't been able to solve for 2 years.
Vladimirovich, that's right. I can understand that in reality. In this scientific study, a new topic was discovered, a new subject of research in science. That is, it feels as if we, your consciousness, and we didn't expect this, are operating in some other frequency range in which we can more broadly perceive the entire situation that exists in the world. And where perhaps it is possible to resolve parallel logical chains.
Yes, so to speak, it is a possibility. But I would like to continue with this for a little bit longer. Here's what I mean. The thing is, when I came back, it suddenly turned out that the methods developed there, the methods for influencing the surrounding world through consciousness in particular, and the methods for obtaining informational things of some kind you see work here as well.
And
This was in fact a truly astonishing discovery for me.